Tonight, we are delighted to be joined by Aaron Gertz. Aaron, who was born and raised in Tallahassee, Florida, spent a semester of high school in Israel through the Reform Movement's High School in Israel program. This had a profound impact on him. After returning to the US and completing a degree in economics at Washington University in St. Louis, Aaron made Aliyah, officially becoming a citizen of Israel in 2008. So since then, Aaron has served in the Army as a combat engineer. He still serves on reserve duty. He has taught Jewish history, and he has earned his living as a guide and is a licensed tour guide in Israel. For the last several years, he's lived in Tel Aviv and given tours of many aspects of this extraordinary city, his new hometown. Today, he lives in the Florentin neighborhood of South Tel Aviv with his wife, Noi, and their daughter. We are delighted, I shall say, that Aaron is in New York right now and able to give us a program in the evening when it's not in the middle of the night for him, as he is visiting his parents, who are, like many of you, Central Synagogue members. So Aaron, thank you for being here, and everybody, thank you for joining us. We will have time for questions at the end. If you're thinking of a question, make sure you put it in the chat box so none of us forget it. But right now, it is our pleasure to welcome Aaron. Thanks, Aaron.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. I was just sharing with Rabbi Berman, other than the obvious challenges of living in Israel over the last 10 months, I'm a tour guide and I love talking about Israel. And I haven't had nearly as many opportunities to do that as I wish that I would have over the last 10 months. So it's just my great pleasure to be here with you all this evening. So thank you all very, very much for inviting me, to Rabbi Berman and to Marina for organizing. I'm sure there are other folks at Central Synagogue who are involved in the organization who deserve thanks, and I don't know their names. So thank you to them as well. The goal for this evening I'm going to try and talk for about 45 minutes. Again, I should warn you, I'm a tour guide, so I really like to talk. So I'm going to do my best not to go much beyond 45 minutes to try and allow, a good 15 minutes for questions at the end. And the goal is going to be to try and talk about Israeli society. And I always tell people, when you come to Israel, of course you should go visit the Western Wall, the Kotel. It's such a profound and moving and important place. And if you ask the average Israeli how often they think about the Western Wall in their day-to-day lives, the answer for most of them is not very much. And so the idea here is to try and use street art, to try and use something that's a little bit more sort of day-to-day, sort of out in the built environment, to try and talk about Israeli society. And the truth is, in my deeply unbiased opinion as a person who gives graffiti tours, that's always an interesting thing to do, because it's always interesting to understand sort of modern Israeli society. As you can imagine, these days, over the last 10 months, a huge amount of the street art, of the graffiti, deals with October 7th and what it feels like to be Israeli in the shadow of October 7th. Now, when I say what it feels like to be Israeli, you might be aware there are 10 million people living in Israel. So I don't want to act like I'm speaking on behalf of everyone. Again, those of you who are familiar with Israel, which I'm guessing is most of you, you know very well that there are sort of distinct sectors of Israeli society. So, okay, ultra-Orthodox don't typically do a lot of graffiti, right? Arab citizens of Israel typically don't do a lot of graffiti. So I don't want to act like I'm representing all 10 million people here, but I do hope that I'm going to give you an overview of what it feels like to have lived in Israel, to be Israeli over the last 10 months. So that's the goal for this evening. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I will say one final thank you before I start, and that's to Rabbi John Linder, who took many of the beautiful pictures that I'm going to be using. So thank you to him. I don't know if he's on here now. So I want to start out by talking a little bit about the sort of dramatic change that you've seen in street art since October 7th. So I want to start out by introducing you into one of the more prolific artists in Tel Aviv. And by the way, everything we're going to be seeing is from South Tel Aviv. That's really the sort of epicenter of the graffiti scene. Of course, there are here and there other places. There's a bit of a scene in Haifa. There's a bit of a scene in Jerusalem. There's an interesting exhibit actually near the Dead Sea. So here and there are a couple other little places, but far and away the epicenter of the scene is in Tel Aviv. Now, the Tel Aviv metro area has a population of 4 million people. Again, I'm including the larger Tel Aviv area out of a population of 10 million, which means that Tel Aviv is a pretty big slice of Israel. So again, while I don't want to claim to speak for every single Israeli, I do think it's a fair representation. So I want to start with an artist named The Misk. And she is, again, a very prolific artist. She does art all over the place. And this is what her art normally looks like. So this is, say, an old piece by the Misk. You can see her name down there on the bottom, right, the Misk. And you'll see some letters in Hebrew. And I'm going to give you a second to see if you can read it. And I'm going to give you a hint. Your non-Jewish friends and family will also recognize what's written there. So I'll give you a second to try and read it, and then we'll sound it out together. So for me, this is the hardest kind of reading Hebrew to read because it's not actually Hebrew. So if we sound it out slowly together, you'll see it says, I've been kissed by a rose. I've been kissed by a rose, right? Those are song lyrics. And this is her shtick. She takes these English song lyrics, she writes them in Hebrew. Again, we could talk a lot more about why she does that. And it's, again, I've spoken to her about it. She says it's to be silly, it's to be cute. The song was stuck in my head. But this is typical for her. So this is another one that's typical for her. I'll give you a second to try and read the Hebrew. Now you figured out the shtick. Let's see if you can figure out which song lyrics those are. Again, I'm guessing almost everyone here is going to be familiar with them. So it says, take me down to Paradise City, right? Take me down to Paradise City. Again, the famous song lyrics. One more just to, again, to give you a sense of who she is. And she does say some artistic stuff here as well. But again, the crux of it is the sort of shtick she writes. So this one says, I'll give ya shelter from the storm, right? I'll give you shelter from the storm. Again, song lyrics that I'm guessing many of you are familiar with. Cute, nice art, nothing too serious, nothing too deep. And what she's done now, her most recent piece, not her most recent, but one of the pieces she's done since October 7th is this. Which I think you'll agree with me, this is not cute and silly and nice. This is very, very intense. It's a huge piece. I don't know how well that comes through here. It's probably, I don't know, 60, 70 feet long. I mean, it's a really, really enormous piece covering this huge section of the wall there. Here it is again, just a little bit from the other side. And for those of you with a bit of an art background, you might actually be able to recognize this is her take on arguably the most famous war painting of all time, Guernica by Pablo Picasso, which again, I'm sure I'm saying incorrectly, and I am not an art history major, so I don't want to try and analyze Picasso's Guernica, again, one of the most important paintings of the 20th century. But Picasso painted this in response to the bombing of Guernica as part of the Spanish Civil War. And it's designed to show the horrors of war. So again, you can see here Picasso's piece. I'll go back so you can see here some of the similarities. How the Misk, this is an Israeli artist, has taken this piece and made it her own. Of course, you can see right there in the middle, that's 7/10. Of course, Israelis, say the day and then the month. So 7/10 is referring to the 7th of October, October 7th. Again, just to point out a couple of examples, you can see the bull up here in the top left, which you see here, this purple bull. You can see the sort of decapitated head here along the ground that, again, you can see here in Picasso's as well. You've got the hand here. Interestingly, the Misk has chosen to do this hand together with some headphones and the bracelet there that says Nova. And again, I'm guessing that almost all of you know the name Nova. I wish we didn't, but it was a music festival that got hit particularly hard on October 7th. And if we go back to the sort of first image I showed you, you can see she did also write some words here. So I'll give you a second to see if you can read what it says there. It's English written in Hebrew, and it's song lyrics. I'm guessing these are not song lyrics that many of you are familiar with, unless you're, particularly knowledgeable about, Welsh alternative rock bands from the 1990s. So what it says here is, if you tolerate this, right? If you tolerate this. And the reference is to, again, a Welsh rock band from the late 90s. They wrote this song based on this poster. So here again on the right there, you're seeing the piece by the Misk where it says, if you tolerate this. And over on the left, you're seeing one of the propaganda posters used to encourage volunteers to come and support the Republicans in the Spanish Civil War. And you can see the phrase there, if you tolerate this, your children will be next. And this band took this lyric and used it again to sort of pay homage to the Welsh volunteers that saw this that thought about how horrible this was and really took this to heart and went and volunteered in the Spanish Civil War. Now, coming back to the MISC and to October 7th, we could argue over why exactly she's using that song lyric. And by the way, every artist I've ever asked about their graffiti says, once it's out in the world, it's for you to interpret. So I don't want to act like there's one right answer for how to interpret this, how to interpret her art and why she's using this particular song lyric. We could certainly say, for example, maybe she's getting angry at the rest of the world for tolerating, say, the buildup of terrorism, supporting terrorism, tolerating the terrorism that you find, say, Hamas and things like that. Maybe she's angry at our own authorities for their behavior, that they've tolerated all sorts of terrible things and it's led to this. Maybe she's saying, based on what we just saw, we now have to react much more strongly. Again, we could interpret it in all sorts of different ways. But what I really wanted you to get here is the sheer horror of war. War has always been horrible, and that is true on October 7th, and that has been true since October 7th, and we can feel that in Israel. The next slide that I want to show you, again, to demonstrate the sort of change that we see in street art, maybe not what you were expecting to see a crowded Tel Aviv soccer game. This is a picture from a few years ago. And the reason I show you this is to see the banner down there at the bottom below the fans in the stands where it says Ultras Hapoel. So Hapoel Tel Aviv is the big Tel Aviv soccer team. Ultras Hapoel is their big fan club. Again, those of you who are follow Israel quite closely, you might remember there's a different fan club, a Jerusalem-based fan club that is sort of gets themselves in trouble for some inappropriate behavior. That's not what we're talking about here. This is just sort of a typical rowdy soccer fan club. So again, when you're thinking of soccer hooligans, the ones who might have had one too many drinks before the game and don't sit down the entire game and are jumping and banging drums. And again, you've seen these kind of folks. That's what we're looking at, Ultras Hapoel. And since October 7th, instead of doing this, they've been doing this. So what you're seeing written here from the far side, it says Hanan Yavlunka, somebody's name. Zayin Lamed, Zichrono Livracha, may his memory be for a blessing. This is commemorating somebody who was a member of the Ultras Hapoel of the Tel Aviv soccer fan club who was killed on October 7th. And what you can see down here below the Zayin Lamed is Mishpachat Hapoel Tel Aviv, and then the UHTA, Ultras Hapoel Tel Aviv. So the soccer hooligans, who again should be out partying and drinking and going crazy and yelling mean things to the opposing team, instead they've now become a commemorative society. Here's one more example where you can see, again, this is somebody's name, Shirat Yam Amar, which is the name of somebody, again, who was killed on October 7th, with the Zichrona Livracha. Down in the bottom left, the Ultras Hapoel, and over here, Aduma Lenetzach, red forever. I show you this to point out that every organization, every business, every nonprofit, every soccer fan club since October 7th has taken a, say, 180-degree turn and is now dealing with different stuff. Since October 7th, this is what Israeli society is dealing with, down to and including the soccer fan club. I want to give you one more example here of, say, people who are commemorating people who were killed on October 7th. So again, you see the 710 up here in the corner. And this one says, Harikud shelo yigamer leolam, the dance that will never end, or that will never end. And again, those of you who are, say, familiar with Israeli songs, one that a particularly popular one is the famous one, Eli, Eli, Shelo Yigamer Leolam, that you might know in English as well, right? Oh Lord, my God, I pray that these things never end, the sand and the sea. So here this artist has taken this iconic, famous song and has repurposed it to talk about these poor kids, frankly, who were killed on October 7th. And my point, again, in showing you this is to try and at least to start out with what it feels like to be in Israel on October 7th. By the way, one of the other things you're seeing all over Israel right now, it's not really the subject of my presentation, so I didn't include it, is all the soldiers who have been killed now. It's now become a custom in Israel to create stickers with a quote from their life, with a picture of their of this person, and you find them now all over the place. So it's this question of how do we commemorate, how do we talk about, how do we say, remember all that happened, and here's a couple of examples. Another powerful way to get your feelings out, to express, to deal with it is, of course, through poetry. And so you found all sorts of poems covering the walls of South Tel Aviv. I'm not going to read the whole one. I just want to read really the title here that says, Ani Petza Patuach. I am an open wound. In the aftermath of October 7th, I have not come up with a better way to describe what it felt like in Israeli society. We felt like open wounds, that it was raw and it hurt. And by the way, I know many of you felt that way as well. So you do not have to live in Israel to feel that way. And the experience, of course, was quite different because I went out into the streets on October 8th and 9th and 10th and still today. And I know that everybody feels exactly the way I do. And for many of you, you went out in the streets, and best case scenario, people didn't know that anything had happened. And worst case scenario, you had to deal with conceivably even negative reactions. But Ani Petza Patuach, I am an open wound, to me is one of the most powerful ways I found to express what it feels like, what it's felt like on October 7th. I included this simple one, first of all, just to show you that when we say street art, you can see this is actually someone who sort of knitted an Israeli flag and stuck it on the wall. When we say street art, it doesn't just mean spray paint or writing on the walls. It can be all sorts of different things. And I'm guessing many of you recognize this first phrase here, Am Yisrael Chai, which we normally say is a feeling of strength, of power, of we're still here, we can get through it. We've been here for 2,000 years, 3,000 years, and we're going to get through it. Here, though, someone's added another phrase. It says, Am Yisrael Chai v'atzuv lo. The people of Israel live and they're sad. The word atzuv means sad. Again, to me, a very simple but a very profound transformation of this sort of typical phrase of strength to talk about actually how sad we are and this feeling of sadness was also, again, part of the mixture of feelings that we felt. Now, this is one of the pieces that went up very soon after October 7th. This is a huge piece. You can see the building there in the background. This piece is probably, 5 stories tall. I'm just referring to the piece there with Superman. That piece, that gray stuff on the bottom, predates October 7th. So what do we see? We see Superman with the big words, don't panic. And of course, Superman is very clearly panicking. And then down in the bottom right of Superman, it says the IDF protects us. You can see here, I'll point to it right there. The IDF protects us. That's all part of the same piece. Now, again, I don't want to act like I know the correct interpretation, but to me, when I see this, what comes to mind for me is incredible cynicism, sarcasm. Because what's supposed to happen? Okay, the bad guys come and attack us. That's been happening on and off for the last 100, 120 years. And if we want to take a more expansive view of Jewish history, say longer than that, but certainly within Israel, it's been happening for the last 100 years. But what's supposed to happen? The IDF goes into the phone booth, puts on our Superman, and we come out, ta-da, and we save the day. Sorry to tell you, that's not what happened on October 7th. That's what's supposed to happen. On October 7th, Superman, the IDF, our security forces, our vaunted intelligence, were nowhere to be found. Not only that, but it took hours and hours and hours to actually get down there and respond. You read about people who talk about having hidden in bomb shelters for 20 hours. And I would say that this was a violation of the Israeli social contract, and because the Israeli social contract says not that it's always going to be easy, not that it's always going to be, say sunshine and roses, but the Israeli social contract says that if you go and you serve in the army, if you go and you send your kids off to go fight, no more pogroms. That's the deal. The IDF is going to be there to protect you. And on October 7th, that was gone. There was no IDF. There was no protection. I'll go a step further. I would argue that this was an abrogation of the Zionist contract, because Zionism said, again, not that it's going to be easy. Zionism actually said quite the opposite. Zionism says it's going to be hard as hell. But if you work your butts off, if you get out there and you make the desert bloom and you go out to your field with your plow in one hand and your gun in the other, and you change the nature of what it means to be Jewish, you stop being the indoor kids, you start being the tough guys, you stop being the Woody Allen Jews and start being the Moshe Dayan Jews. If you do all of that, no more pogroms. When the bad guys come, we're going to have an army. We're going to stand there and fight. And on October 7th, again, that was all gone. On October 7th, there was a pogrom. There was a pogrom in sovereign Israel. And you hear stories of the mother covering their kid's mouth so that the terrorists won't hear them, thinking to herself, my grandma described doing this in the Holocaust, and I could never believe there was no way that was possible in my life. And now here I am, and it's actually happening to me. And it's, again, this crisis of faith, this dramatic breach of trust between us and the state, between us and the security services, between us and Zionism and the government and everything we believed in. Who can we trust now? And I would argue that in any relationship, if there's a violation of trust, if there's a breach of trust, if you're going to repair that relationship, again, it doesn't matter, a romantic partnership, a business partnership, a friend, whatever it is, if you're going to repair a breach of trust, the first thing that has to happen is the party that violated the trust has to acknowledge the severity of what happened. And by the way, the head of the chief of staff did that. The head of military intelligence, the head of general intelligence, the defense minister, all of these different officials acknowledged the hugeness of the failure and promised to fix it and to start getting it right. And if you look at the polling numbers, Israelis today basically have faith in the army, and we basically have faith in our intelligence services, and we basically have faith in the defense minister, certainly nowhere near what we had to say prior to October 7th, but that fundamentally a lot of that trust has rebounded. Now, as I'm saying that, I know many, if not most of you are thinking, okay, but there's one glaring exception to that. And of course, you're exactly right. The glaring exception is our prime minister, who's the head of everything, who has very pointedly not accepted responsibility. And therefore, I would argue, therefore, the polling is very clear that Israelis do not. One of Israel's most prominent intellectuals, public intellectuals, a guy named Micha Goodman, says horizontally among each other, among the soldier next to you in the APC, among the family who's going to babysit your kids because you can't get home in time, the trust is there 100%. Vertically, between us and our government, the trust is not there. And that is a fundamental challenge in Israeli society. I would argue, again, my personal opinion, that is the number one challenge that we have in Israeli society. Horizontally, the trust is there, and vertically is not. Now, if you'd like to hear about my politics, I'll be more than happy to tell you and say, I'm not trying to be shy here. I do not believe that what I'm saying is political. I'm not sharing my political views. That is the very widespread view among Israeli society, this lack of trust in our government. And that's a huge, huge issue. And we'll talk about that more moving on. What you see here is for me, it's maybe the saddest thing that I show you in this whole slideshow. So again, you can of course read the English. It's 6 o'clock after the war somewhere. And then in Hebrew, it says, in Israel, kids are born with a short expiration date, and mothers remain, and their hearts are bitter. October 7th. That's what it means to be Israeli today. To be Israeli today means you're either going off to fight yourself, or you're going to send your kids off to fight, and then we're going to open the paper every day and we're going to read about which soldiers were killed. And it's really sad, which is not to say we can't get through it, it's not to say we can't deal with it, but it's sad and it's hard. And again, the idea that kids are born with a short expiration date is, to me, just such a heartbreaking sentiment, but it's a real sentiment that you feel in Israel today. Now, this is a really interesting piece. This is another poem here. This is by an artist named Dina Segev, who writes poetry all over South Tel Aviv. Again, she's been doing this since well before October 7th. And again, I'm used to seeing her poetry. And the truth is, I always thought her poetry was nice, but a little bit parv. Not so meaningful, not so deep. And since October 7th, I found her poetry to be so deep and so meaningful. And you can see here, I've put Genesis, the very beginning of the first book of Genesis, over here on the right, not just because I think it's always nice to include a little Tanakh in a presentation, a little Torah, but because she's actually played on this. And so I want to read to you, for those who can't read the Hebrew by themselves, the beginning of Genesis in Hebrew says, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et ha'aretz, ve'ha'aretz hayta tohu v'bohu v'choshech al pnei tehom. In the beginning, God created heaven and earth, and the earth was null and void, and darkness was on the face of the void, something like that. But that's as written in Genesis. Here, she's changed the first two words. Again, if you look, the first two words as written are Bereshit bara. Here it says Vashuv Natash. I'll translate in just a second. And then you can see she continues, Elohim et hashamayim ve'et ha'aretz, ve'ha'aretz hayta tohu v'bohu v'choshech. Right? She continues with Genesis. What she wrote here is, and once again, God abandoned heaven and earth, and the earth was null and void. That now feels a little bit different. And now she's changed one more word. Instead of darkness on the face of the void or darkness on the face of the depths, now it says, and darkness on the face of everything, and darkness on the face of everything, and darkness on the face of everything. That's what it felt like after October 7th. Now, okay, we're 10 months in. The intensity of the feeling has gone down somewhat, but it's still, we're still having a crisis of faith. Again, it can be a crisis of faith in our government and our beliefs. It could also be a literal crisis of faith. Where was God on October 7th? All those poor people, kids who went to a music festival just to go enjoy themselves, kids who woke up at a friend's house after a sleepover. I mean, the feeling of abandonment was powerful and deep. But there's something else I want to point out here. As you can imagine, graffiti artists, as they tend to be around the world, tend to come from the sort of liberal, secular, non-religious part of the population. That's certainly true in Tel Aviv, the neighborhood where you find most of the graffiti. And I'm guessing there's some folks here who have even been on a graffiti tour before. A lot of it's in Florentin and other neighborhoods in South Tel Aviv. Those are not religious neighborhoods. And yet, when we want to express something deep and meaningful and powerful, what is it we turn to? Torah. Not only that, it's not just that this particular artist decided to turn towards Torah. It's the fact that any Israeli reading this, I would argue even many Arab citizens of Israel, read this and can recognize the reference. You can imagine if you saw a piece of graffiti here in New York that said 7 years ago, or the British are leaving, or forget about the Alamo. Again, you can think of pieces of graffiti that by nature of being American, by nature of having grown up in an American country, you would understand. And somebody British who, again, speaks native level English wouldn't understand because it's cultural, it's not linguistic. And to me, that's one thing that's so interesting about being in Israel. Something it took me, I don't know, probably 10 years of living in Israel to understand is that, I grew up thinking of Jewish as a religion, and it's also a religion, but it's also something much bigger. My favorite description is it's a civilization. But again, we could argue it's a culture, it's a peoplehood. I'll give you one little example to show you what I mean. When you go into a bookstore, you definitely expect to find books about Jewish cooking and Jewish humor. Anyone ever heard of Christian cooking or Muslim humor? Of course not, because Christianity and Islam, they're questions of faith. Again, this is not a better or worse thing. They're just different. When you think of Jewish, you shouldn't think of it together with Christian and Muslim. In my opinion, you'd be better off thinking about it like Sicilian or Kurdish or Catalan. Again, it's a culture, a peoplehood, a civilization, something bigger and broader. And so to me, that also helps us understand that when we see a piece of graffiti like this is Jewish graffiti. Even though the people who are seeing it might not be religious, they're Jewish in the way that I, and I'm guessing many of you are American. Here's another poem by Dina Segev. I promise I won't talk about this one quite as long. I'll read it in Hebrew quickly because the Hebrew is it's much more beautiful and lyrical. So I want you at least to hear the sort of musicality of the language. And then, of course, I'll translate it. It says, V'shuv alenu letzet me'achoshech Mitzrayim hazeh, v'legashesh achar ha'or ha'muftach, o ha'chalav v'ha'dvash, o ma ze haya shehuftach lanu? So now I'll translate. And once again, it's on us to flee this darkness of Egypt and to wander after the promised light, or the milk and the honey, or what was it exactly that was promised to us? So first of all, again, you can see what I'm saying, that the references, in order to understand this piece of graffiti, you have to recognize Choshech Mitzrayim, the darkness of Egypt. You have to understand to follow the promised light means following the tabernacle and the light of God in the wilderness for 40 years. You have to understand when we're talking about milk and honey, it's not just because we like to drink milk and eat honey. Of course, that's a phrase referring to the historic, the promised land, the land of Israel. So again, you can see the Jewish character of the graffiti. To me, I'm always trying to answer this question of what exactly do we mean when we say a Jewish state? It's one of those things that seems like it should be obvious, but it's kind of hard to put your finger on it. And to me, this is the answer, that even our graffiti is Jewish. Now, to get to the actual point of this graffiti, again, to me, this is a heartbreaking piece of graffiti, because to me, what she's saying here is again questioning this idea of this is the promised land. Did you see what happened here on October 7th? Do you see the challenges we're facing here? How can I live? I mean, I say Rabbi Berman mentioned I have a 5.5-year-old daughter. I'm supposed to raise her here with this? And that's a real strand that you find in Israeli society. And by the way, I'm guessing many of you know Israelis who've made the choice, you know what, I don't know if I can live here. And they move to New York or to Berlin or to other places. And that's a real strand of thought in Israeli society. Now, in my opinion, there's a much bigger, much wider strand of thought that says, did you see what happened on October 7th? Do you see how the world still feels about Jews? Thank God we have a piece of land where we can actually fight back, where we can have our own independent country here. I got to do everything I can to dig deep, to hold on here to the first Jewish state we've had in the last 2,000 years. Like, again, for me, that is certainly my view, and I think that is by far the majority view in Israel. But this questioning it's real, and you feel it. Much of this graffiti is sort of squeezed in narrow alleys, so you can see I'm always sort of struggling to get a picture that I can actually get it all in the frame, and there's no cars or motorcycles or stuff like this. This one's actually big enough that you can sort of see where it's located. So I showed you the bigger one. I'm gonna zoom in here. One more piece by Dina Segev. Over here on the left, it says Romi Gonen Adain Chatufa. Romi Gonen, still hostage. And again, she's written this poem here. I'm going to read the poem because the language of the poetry is so beautiful. I want you to hear it, and then, of course, I'll translate it. Yafa she'at, kama yafa v'kama chatufa. U'ma na'aseh עם החיוך הזה שלך, המאיר והרך, שנצרב לנו בנשמה, ואין לנו נשימה, עד שתצעדי, ואחרייך שרשרת ארוכה ארוכה, שרשרת זהב של אהובים שחוזרים הביתה. How beautiful you are, how beautiful and how kidnapped. And what will we do with that smile of yours, that sensitive smile that lights everything up, that's inscribed on our souls? And I don't have any breath until you march out, and after you, a long, long line, a golden line of loved ones returning home. As you can imagine, the questions of the question of the hostages in Israel is a deeply challenging question. I mean, I don't even know how to describe it. And it continues to be the subject of ongoing protests. And I'll show you as well. I mean, we could have done a whole slideshow just with different ways that people have tried to draw attention to the plight of the hostages, to encourage the government to find a way to make a deal to bring them home. But to me, actually, something very interesting has been happening. That over time, the nature of the support for the hostages and the pressure being applied on the government has changed. And if you go back to October, November, December, there was, of course, support for the hostages and support for the families, but there was not overt attempts to pressure the government into making a deal. And that has changed over time. And now there is very clearly a huge movement intensely pressuring the government to make a deal. Now, I do not have to tell any of you that is a, let's say, questionable negotiating tactic. If you are negotiating with someone, the last thing you want to do is to show the other side how bad you want what they're holding. And of course, we know perfectly well Hamas is watching, is seeing every single thing we do. They're seeing the pressure being applied on Bibi. They're seeing the growing crowds saying, make a deal, bring them home. And so to me, there's a question of why is this happening? Because again, the leaders of the hostage family movements, they understand perfectly well what I'm explaining. This is not some brilliant negotiating tactic that I'm familiar with that nobody else knows, obviously. And so why is it that that's happening? And it gets back to what I was saying before, a lack of trust in our government, a lack of faith in our government, which again is very different in a lack of faith in the country, or a lack of faith in the country's ability to achieve our war aims, to bring safety back to Israel. And if you ask Israelis, again, can we win this? The answer is still an overwhelming yes. And if you ask them, can this government accomplish the war aims they have set out? The answer is now mostly no. And if you believe that about our government, and again, I want to be so careful that I am distinguishing here between faith in our government and faith in ourselves and faith in our country. Because faith in our government, which again, pick your favorite poll, a right-wing pollster, a left-wing pollster, it started out low and it's been going lower and lower and lower and lower. If you do not believe that this government is capable of achieving the war aims, well, then obviously make a deal right now and get those poor people out of that horrible hell they're in. And so the change in how the hostage families and the protests, the change in how they're behaving, again, to me, shows this tremendous lack of faith in our current government. Again, I'm sorry, there's things that I could go on for an hour, 2 hours, and I'm sure you have questions, but I want to try and talk about as many different things as we can. I'll just point out one other thing here about where it says, let my people go over here. If you ask me, say a nice American boy who, say, grew up America, red, white, and blue, if you ask me to think about the theme of freedom, I might well think, give me liberty or give me death, or the Emancipation Proclamation, or the Declaration of Independence. If you ask an Israeli Jew to think about the theme of freedom, there's one thing that comes to mind. It's Yad Mitzrayim, the Exodus from Egypt, because again, that's the nature of what it means to grow up in a Jewish society. Again, my wife grew up in a very non-religious household, and yet, if you ask her about the theme of freedom, of course, that's what's going to come to mind. Now, I've been talking a lot of doom and gloom and commemorating and things like that. And there is, say, over here on the right, you can see one more piece with that sort of vibe, right? You can see it says, originally it said, I have 3 dead friends. And then unfortunately, they had to come and cross it out and change it to 4. I have 3 dead friends, war zone. You can also see over here on the far left, another bring them home. Again, I could do an entire presentation just with different types of bring them home, supporting a hostage deal, things like that. But that's not the only thing you're seeing in street art. And what you're actually seeing here is a woman named Rachel, who perhaps some of you have heard of, Rachel from Ofakim. Ofakim is the town furthest from the Gaza Strip that was invaded on October 7th. And Rachel is an older woman. She's in her 70s. She and her husband were at home on that day, and terrorists came and invaded her home. And Rachel decided, this is not the end for me. I'm not going down like this. But again, she's an older woman. There are terrorists with guns pointing at her in her home. I mean, she's not going to fight them off. So what is she to do? She decides she's going to host them. She's going to treat them like guests. So she makes them tea. She makes them cookies. She sings them songs. She successfully distracts them long enough for hours and hours and hours until finally the SWAT team arrives and is able to burst into her home and to save her and her husband. And so you're also seeing stories like that. For example, here's a piece you see on the wall as well. So this is the wide view here. Now I've sort of cut out the middle section so you can see a little bit better. We talked about the lack of response of the military forces and how long it took them to go and deal, again, the initial failure and how long it took them to actually deal with the invasion on October 7th. And we could equally well talk about the failure of the government to provide services since then, to get the northern residents back to their homes, to find accommodation, to provide proper mental health services to people who have been evicted from their homes, to soldiers. I mean, the list goes on and on and on and on. And yet I'm deeply optimistic about the future of Israel, specifically because of individual citizens stepping in to fill every void. And here you're seeing specifically 3 military examples. So over here on the left is Noam Tivon, who went down to rescue his son and his family. Over here, you're seeing, excuse me, Yisrael Ziv. Here in the middle, you're seeing Yair Golan. For those who follow Israeli politics, you might say, I've heard that name. Yair Golan is one of those people who was just sort of known as a military genius, and he rose up very quickly and high through the ranks, and there was talk that perhaps he might be the next chief of staff, but he has quite left-wing politics. And all 3 of these gentlemen had long been released from the army. And on October 7th, they got various calls from their son, from a friend. They just understood. And so in many cases, they literally got a pistol, got in the car, and drove down and started fighting. And in many cases, saved dozens and dozens of people. By the way, the one on the left, Noam Timon, there's actually the producers of Fauda are making a movie about that particular case. But Yair Golan has now become the leader of the combined left-wing political party in Israel. There has been virtually no serious left-wing politicians in Israel, or I shouldn't say that, politicians who have garnered serious levels of support in Israel for a long time. And there's a chance that perhaps Yair Golan will be able to do that, but we'll have to see. So again, more stories here of heroism. This is another one, again, not necessarily what you would expect. This is a woman named Rimon Kirsch. She was taken hostage, And the photo on the right, you're seeing her being released from hostility. There's actually a whole video again. If you're interested, you can find the whole video. And this became a very prominent meme in Israel because here she is, this woman in, say, clearly in her pajamas, basically, with this masked Hamas terrorist holding a gun. And she is standing there showing him damn well exactly what she thinks of him, with defiance gleaming from her eyes. And so again, you can see that these graffiti artists have taken this and used it as a symbol. Here again, you can see the focus on the resilience, on a more positive view. So over on the left, you're seeing two soldiers, presumably going off to fight. You're seeing over here one of the soldiers' partner and kid left behind. Now, and you can see we'll be waiting. Now, Israel is actually unique among developed countries in that we actually still have large families. That's true even if you specifically ask non-religious folks, right? If you exclude any religious, any Orthodox folks and just ask non-Orthodox folks, we still have a lot of kids, meaning the soldiers who go off to fight are almost always leaving behind a partner and a number of young kids. So I'm not going to try and talk to you about how difficult it is to be a soldier in Gaza. You can figure that out. But I want to talk for a minute about what it means to be one of these people left behind. And by the way, you can notice the soldiers and the folks, the family left behind are all faceless because this is everybody. This is the whole of Israeli society. Being left behind means all of a sudden you're now single parenting. You're single parenting with 2, 3 kids, let's say under the age of 7. There's now bomb alarms going off. You got to get your kids to the bomb shelter. I served as a combat engineer in the Army. I had a very calm service, and yet my mother will tell you for the 1.5 years that I was in my mandatory service, she did not sleep for one night. You can imagine what it's like when your partner's off in Gaza. So you're now single parenting with 3 kids under terrible circumstances, not sleeping. You're still working for full time. It's a lot. And that is what it is meant to be in Israeli over the last 7 months. And yet, we're doing it. We've bonded together. We're going to talk more about that in a second. The family next door helps to take care of the kids, and the neighbors down the street are taking the kids after work. And the young single person at work is helping to pick up some of the extra load. And we're finding a way to make it work. These 2 images on the right are, for me, among the most profound. Again, I served in a combat unit. I have a young daughter. To me, I see these pictures and I can only imagine hugging my own daughter and going off to fight. I have been very fortunate. I have not been called up since October 7th. So I have not actually had this experience. But I want to look a little bit more deeply for just 1 second about one of these, because what you're really seeing here is a story that we tell about ourselves. And the story that we tell about ourselves is that in order for my Jewish daughter to have a safe place to live, to have a place to grow up, I have to get on my uniform, get my gun, and go do everything I can to hold on to this little piece of land, to hold on to the only Jewish state where I actually have a chance to protect my Jewish daughter. And that's very different from the stories that people around the world tell about us, and particularly the story that the Arab world tells about us. Because the story that the Arab world tells about us, without going into too much detail, is that if they just make it a little bit more difficult, if they just hold out, if they just resist a little bit longer, we're all about to leave. This country, this colonialist country, is about to collapse from the internal contradiction. Again, I'm not trying to argue the truth of any of this. What I'm saying is that what it feels like to be Israeli is the exact opposite of that. That when it gets harder here, when our neighbors attack, when October 7th happens, we all think, this was so terrible. I have to do anything I can to hold on, to save one little piece of one state in the world where I can make sure that I have where my Jewish daughter can grow up safely. I'm going to skip ahead just a little bit. Again, I'm sorry. There's so much more that I want to talk about. This is okay. I'm not going to skip this one. I'm sorry. I'm just going to read it in English because it's such a beautiful, powerful piece. It says, "We will once again dance in her memory until the sunrise. We will once again surrender to the sounds under the orange sky. Her smile will light up and inscribe itself on our souls forever. Like those moments when she was completely alone. We will once again turn up the volume. We will once again learn to let go and to fly. We will once again, together with the scars on our souls, together with the scars on our bodies, we will once again dance in her memory and the memory of her friends. And when the sun rises, we will remember her face." If you come to Israel right now, you will see the markets are full. People are going out. It wasn't like that in October and November. But Israeli society, again, I know resilience is sort of a catchword. But over the last 10 months, we in Israel have really understood what that meant. It means waking up in the morning and reading the terrible news and seeing which soldier was killed and then taking a deep breath and putting your phone down and being determined to go out and keep living your life. Because we have to. Because this is too important not to do that. And I think that this poem captures that beautifully, this idea that we have to turn up the volume and dance and let go, even if it's hard, even if it's challenging, even if our hearts will never be 100% whole ever again. We have to go on and live our lives and keep fighting. Here you see the phrase strong together, chazakim bayachad. Again, I'm gonna skip over that because I want to get into a little bit of the politics. Again, here's another just fascinating piece. This is actually a piece done together with a Persian artist, an Iranian dissident who lives in the U.S., together with an Israeli artist celebrating an Iranian dissident, a woman named Hosar, that's you're seeing there in the middle on the line, an Israeli soldier of Persian descent who was killed on October 7th over there on the right, and Queen Esther over there on the left. She's holding a pomegranate, the symbol of Israel, a lotus, the symbol of Iran. Again, the idea being to show that much of the Iranian people wants to renew our historic ties. Again, I could spend hours just talking about this piece. I'm going to move forward because I want to get into a little bit more of the politics here. Now, this is a piece that you see in Israel. You've seen in Israel over the years. Over here on the right, and I'm going to try and finish up in 4 more minutes. I don't know how I never get through as much as I want to. Over here on the left is a famous Israeli cartoon character named Srulik. He's the symbol of Israeliness. Over here on the right is this the symbol of Palestinianness, a character named Hangala, who's the symbol of the Palestinian refugee. Right? You can see he's a little bit, looks a little bit like he's had a tough go of it. He got a patch in his clothes. And so here you have the symbol of Israeliness and the symbol of Palestinianness with their arms around each other, looking off into a brighter future. And you could see this as a symbol of coexistence in many places in Israel over the last decades. Today, what you see is this. That here you've seen this symbol of coexistence where now the Israeli is being stabbed in the back. And it's a question in Israel. How do we possibly move forward? Because for a long time, the right wing in Israel said, we can just rule over the Palestinians indefinitely. And then the first intifada, the second intifada showed to the majority of the Israeli population that is not realistic. And then the left said, you know what? If we give them self-determination, if we pull every single Jew and settler out of Gaza, they are going to turn it into a place that we can actually make peace with. And I think you'd be hard-pressed to find an Israeli that believes that today. And so it's a huge question in Israel. How do we possibly move forward? The ideas of the right and the ideas of the left have both been proven to not work. And so, again, I'm not trying to argue my personal politics, but that's the feeling here in Israel of how do we possibly move forward? I mentioned the lack of faith and the criticisms of the government, which is very, very powerful. This is one, to me, very clever way of showing that. So over here on the left in 1973, you have Prime Minister Golda Meir. She was prime minister during the Yom Kippur War, which, again, many times has been compared to what you're finding on October 7th. The dramatic intelligence failure, the arrogance to assume that the enemy would never try something so bold. And what's written above Golda says, a wise person learns from his mistakes. And over here in 2020-23, above Bibi, it says, that's life. Again, the implication being that Golda recognized the failure and was determined to learn from it and acknowledged that despite the fact that she was not a military person, that she was not in charge of the military, and that all the commissions basically found that she did nothing wrong, that she still accepted responsibility. That's in sharp contrast to Bibi, who has been insensitive, who has been unwilling to accept responsibility. This is another piece dealing with this same theme. So for those who follow Israeli politics, which I'm guessing as many of you know that Bibi is actually under indictment for 3 different charges. And there have been anti-Bibi protests going on for many, many years. And one of the things that would be chanted at the protests were shochad, mirma, v'hafarat imunim. Corruption, bribery, and breach of trust. Here they've written shochad, mirma, bribery. corruption. And instead of haf'arat imunim with an aleph, they've written hafkarat. So instead of now saying breach of trust, it now says abandonment of the masses. So they've taken this traditional anti-Bibi chant, this chanting about, again, bribery, corruption, breach of trust, together with bribery, and they've now changed it to bribery, corruption, abandonment of the masses, either just accusing him of this failure, or perhaps even saying someone who is behaving so unethically, bribery, corruption, bringing these corrupt people into the government, this is the result. And one final one I'll show you, again, I would love to show you lots of others, but I'm running out of time. This is a very clear anti-Bibi piece.
Aaron?
Yeah.
Aaron, just jumping in, that if you could choose maybe a couple more, and then we'll turn to questions.
Okay, so I'll do one or two more. So here again, I think it's fairly self-explanatory, so I'll try not to talk too much about it. This is Bibi Netanyahu, the prime minister. What he's saying is we must save the hostages, and what he's thinking is I must save myself. Again, I'm not trying to argue whether or not that is actually what he is, that is his actual views. I'm saying that is what a huge amount of Israelis believe, that because of all the things he has done, no one is prepared to sit in a governing coalition with him except for the far right wing and the ultra-Orthodox. And so in order to stay in power, he has to placate those two constituencies, and they will not allow a hostage deal. And so the implication here, again, is that Bibi cares more about his political achieving the aims of the war, including bringing back the poor hostages who have now for 10 months been in hell. So you tell me, Rabbi Berman, should I go do one or two more, or should I just go ahead and stop?
Yeah, we have a bunch of questions for you, but I'd love for you to get through the ones that you think are important.
So you know what, I'll share this. I'm glad I skipped to this one, because this is a very different one. And the truth is, this is not something that you see very often. So it says 10,000 broken hearts, both in Gaza and in Sderot, again, the town in Israel near Gaza that was invaded on October 7th, both in Gaza and in Sderot. Little girls want to live. So it was important for me to show this to you, because Israelis do understand the suffering that's going on in Gaza. By the way, it's very different, because we don't see images coming out of Gaza plastered all over the news and all over everywhere. We don't see that plastered everywhere, but we do understand half the population of Gaza is under 18. And it is heartbreaking that Hamas has embedded themselves in such a way that despite our very best efforts, that there is, of course, damage to people who are uninvolved. And so this is also graffiti you see, even if you don't see it very often, because the truth is, after October 7th, I think the focus of our sympathy is going to ourselves, even if we can still acknowledge that, of course, there is lots of sympathy deserved on the other side. Yeah, I think this one is fairly self-explanatory.
So
this one as well, I think.
Aaron, this has been just
yes,
breaking up.
Okay.
I'm so sorry. I just want you to know how extraordinary this talk has been and how much we appreciate it. There have been a couple of questions about how the art goes up. Who selects it? Who gets a spot? Are things painted over? Do the original artists know that? How do these works appear on the walls of Florentin?
Sure. So I'm going to give a very wishy-washy answer, which is it depends. The nature of graffiti is that any idiot 19-year-old can go be an idiot. I regret to inform you that 19-year-olds in Israel are just as idiotic as 19-year-olds in the US. I say I'm sorry to any 19-year-olds here. I'm sure that you're very thoughtful, and speaking for myself, I was an idiot as a 19-year-old. So the truth is that there are no rules about graffiti. The stuff that I'm showing you is intentionally almost exclusively stuff that is done without permission. There are all sorts of art installations. Again, I'm sure you are all familiar with all of the art at Hostage Square. And again, there's a huge number of official sanctioned art installations that you can find. I was intentionally showing you stuff that is say done illegally, quote unquote. In a neighborhood like Florentin, it's so common that say nobody's getting upset about it, right? It's, you know, if you were to go to the front door of, say, whatever hotel you stayed at last time you came to Israel, okay, then yeah, you'd get in trouble. But as long as you're in the right place and you're at the right time, there's not really typically any consequences. A serious artist would never sort of intentionally cover up another serious artist. But okay, it turns out, you know, sometimes 19-year-olds are 19-year-olds, and they will write "Bob was here" on top of a beautiful, meaningful piece of graffiti. That happens, I would say, even less with this type of graffiti than it does with normal graffiti, but it can happen. That's the nature of graffiti.
Thank you. Now, the last piece that you spoke about at some length, that little girls just want to live, whichever side of the border they're on. Is that kind of on its own? Is that an outlier, or do you see additional indications of empathy for the innocents in this conflict on both sides?
So you do not see a lot of graffiti dealing with the pain in Gaza. I think that if you were to ask the typical Israeli, and I think that this is true of me as well, that to me, you do see a little bit of graffiti about that, not much. That is, I think it is fair to call it an outlier. We have been through so much pain for us. That's what we're dealing with. That's what we're focused on, which is, again, not to say Israelis don't recognize pain of the other side. If you ask the typical Israeli, again, we are all aware that half the Gaza population is under the age of 18. And okay, say, just like I think my 5.5-year-old daughter is a pure innocent angel, I am confident saying, and not only me, that all Israelis recognize that the 5.5-year-old daughters in Gaza are also pure innocent angels and are in a terrible, terrible, terrible circumstance. I think that for most Israelis, again, it's not that we don't understand that, but it's what we're expressing, we are going through something so horrible, so difficult, so challenging for us that the expressions that you're seeing are of us trying to deal with that.
So I'm still looking for questions in our chat box, including one from Edith asking if artists are arrested if they're found painting the walls of Florentin. How accepted is this as a public gallery?
So look, the artists don't come and do it in the middle of a weekday. You know what I mean? They'll do it at night. They'll do it on Shabbat. Again, it depends where. If you go to, you know, the new building they just put up and do it on the front door, then you're a lot more likely to get in trouble than you are if you go in the middle of the night and do it at the, you know, the building that should have been torn down 5 years ago, or that's already covered with graffiti. Or so it's. I mean, again, it depends on where. It depends on what. I have never. I mean, in Israel, it's also you don't get you just get fined. You don't get taken to jail. It's less severe than what you would find in some places in the U.S. I have never actually heard of an Israeli artist getting fined. I have heard stories of Israeli artists cleverly talking their way out of getting fined. That, you know, a cop did come and stop them, and you know, the artist said, well, you know, there was something really inappropriate written here, and there are kids who play here, and so I was just covering that up. And the cop said, yeah, whatever, be on your way. And so I've never actually heard of it, but that is the law.
So just going to ask you a couple more questions. Do you see any graffiti from religious folks or from folks on the right of the political spectrum?
Yeah, so I think that most of what I am presenting reflects a wide swath of Israeli society, that it is neither left nor right, nor religious nor secular. Again, when I talk about the lack of faith in our government, that is not a left wing or a right wing talking point. You know, most of the right wing does not. When you look at the polling data for if Bibi has to choose between his personal interest and the national interest, it's like 92% think he will choose his personal interest. So when I share that, I'm not giving a left-wing talking point. I would even go even further to say there is virtually no such thing as left-wing in Israel and hasn't been for 15 years. I mean, if you look at the Knesset today, Israel's parliament, out of 120 seats, there are 4 that describe themselves as left-wing. If Yair Golan, who I mentioned, has a big comeback, he's going to get 10 seats. I mean, this tiny little fraction. So I don't think that I'm giving a left-wing view. It is true. I'm not sharing the ultra-Orthodox view, although I think even the ultra-Orthodox would agree with a certain amount of what we're saying, although it is always difficult to try and get a real read about that particular society without being in that, a member of that society. I would say also, again, I don't want to speak on behalf of Israeli Arabs, although I will point out, and if you are interested, by the way, there are Israeli Arabs that you can follow and get this information. So Lucy Aharish, for example, is an Arab-Israeli journalist who speaks in English frequently. George Deek is an Arab-Israeli diplomat who also speaks more sort of social media oriented. You have Yosef Haddad, who again gives an Arab-Israeli viewpoint. But the polling is very clear that as a result of October 7th, Arab citizens of Israel feel much more Israeli. Again, the polling is very clear on that. You want to argue and say the polls are lying. We can discuss the methodology of the pollsters, but the polling is very, very clear about that. And so I think that even many Arab Israelis would agree with much of what I was saying. Again, with the cautionary note that say perhaps you have noticed I am not an Arab citizen of Israel and I am not ultra-Orthodox. So there's a limit to how much I want to speak on their behalf.
Aaron, is there any last thought that you want to leave us with this evening about Tel Aviv street art, Israeli society right now, from where you're standing and sitting?
So I guess I'll put my information back up here, just so if anyone was interested, that you could see it. The thing that I want to leave you with is a long known quote in Israel, which is, "We've been through Pharaoh, we'll get through this." It is hard in Israel right now. We're feeling that as a family. It is very, very, very difficult, not knowing when Iran is going to attack, when Hezbollah is going to attack, how long this is going to last. It is very, very, very difficult. We have felt the support of the US and especially of the American Jewish community. Please keep doing it. Please start making your plans to come visit Israel. I appreciate you probably shouldn't come in the next month, but there's a lot of rebuilding, reimagining to do. And beyond that, I am deeply optimistic about the future of Israeli society. Something I didn't talk about as much as I probably should have was the way that Israeli society came together after October 7th. That prior to October 7th, we were at each other's throats. These different sectors of Israeli society were yelling and screaming and fighting nonstop. And after October 7th, all of a sudden, the trafiest restaurant in Tel Aviv is getting a kosher certificate so they can prepare kosher food to send to soldiers who might keep kosher. And all of a sudden, the ultra-Orthodox are paying Shiva visits to secular soldiers. And all of a sudden, Arab villages are adopting full neighborhoods in Sderot to provide them with home-cooked meals. So I am very, very optimistic about the future of Israeli society. I think we have some serious challenges moving forward. I am more concerned about the internal challenges within Israeli society than I am about the external challenges, which, again, I do not want to belittle. They are very challenging. But we've been through Pharaoh, and we'll get through this. And please come soon. We would love to see you. We're still here. And I would say that the creation of Israeli society has always been a joint project between the Jews living in Israel and the Jewish community in America. And that goes back all the way to 1948 and the founding of the state. And I can tell you, speaking for myself, and I guess I'll speak on behalf of all Israelis, we're going to be there doing our part. And we appreciate you being here, doing your part, and just to keep it up and to come again soon.
Thank you, Aaron, and thanks all of you for coming tonight.
If anyone has any questions they didn't get a chance to ask, please feel free to reach out. Say you have my email here, say my phone number. You can follow us on. I won't say that we're the most interesting follow on social media in the world, but we do have social media accounts. And we give all sorts of walking tours all over Tel Aviv. And say, please feel free to be in touch, whether it's a question about something we spoke about tonight or anything else.
Have a great night, everybody, and a wonderful end of your summer. We'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.